Okay, welcome to everybody online. Thanks for joining, whether you're doing it live or later. Glad you're here with us. Just to update everyone, we think, as far as we know, everyone's out of the hospital. Some still recovering at home, and so continue to pray for them. But also today we learned that Zilla Dillinger passed away, had a heart attack, and I think probably you saw the email earlier, but we want to pray for her family. They're still making arrangements, so we don't know any of those details, and I'm sure they'll be sent out when they become known. Anybody else that we need to update that I'm not aware of?
Marshall said they thought they might be here on Sunday.
Oh, good. Yay. That'll be good for all of them. Great. Well, it's good to hear that they're making progress. Well, let's pause and have a word of prayer tonight. Father, as always, we come to you thankful for life, thankful for the love that you show us. Thank you for the salvation that you have provided already for us. We ask that we live in that salvation, in that glory, in your glory, that we reflect it to the people around us, to each other, so that we may be more in your image, more formed in the ways that you are. So we're thankful for the opportunities you give us and thankful for the experiences that shape us. We pray for our country. We pray continually about COVID. We ask that people be protected from its consequences, that the vaccine roll out, that we continue to watch out for each other. Pray this prayer tonight in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we're continuing in Ezra. We're in chapter 4. So, have you ever read one of those books where you get a certain page and you make a decision, kind of pick your own ending? Tonight's going to kind of be like that. You get to choose. I won't force one way on you or the other, but it is unclear what the middle part of this chapter is exactly talking about, which to me is not a big deal because I think the point is valid. But we're going to take a diversion even before we get to Ezra 4, because here's what I want to remind you. A lot of people, 50,000 or so, left Babylon, went back, but all those people, lots of people still in Babylon, still under Persian rule, living elsewhere other than Israel. And it's not like the whole story just shifts to Israel. Remember, there's a lot going on in Babylon still. One of those things is Daniel. And coincidence or not, you can decide. The same year they start rebuilding the temple, Daniel, in Daniel starting chapter 10, going through the end of Daniel chapter 12, has his last vision. And so just as a backdrop, just to expand our picture, here's all this rebuilding and renewing going on in Israel, and at the same time, God's working in Daniel in Babylon. So just a couple of snippets to remind you about that vision. So this is chapter 10, verse 1. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks. It's a pretty heavy vision, right? You're depressed for 3 weeks. I ate no choice food, no meat or wine touched my lips, and I used no lotions at all until the 3 weeks was over. His his pandemic, his quarantine was only 3 weeks. But, you could tell. So this is what he saw in verse 4. On the 24th day of the first month, as I was standing on the bank of the great river, the Tigris, I looked up, and there before me was a man dressed in linen with a belt of fine gold from Uphaz around his waist. His body was like topaz. His face was like lightning. His eyes like flaming torches. His arms and legs like the gleam of burnished bronze. And his voice was like the sound of a multitude. I don't know what he ate before he went to bed, but he gave him a pretty weird dream, right? A vision. And I may disappoint you, but I'm not going to really get into what all this means. And there's a big middle part here we're not going to read. It's about the kings of the north, and then there's a king of the south. There's a lot of fighting, a lot of changing of kings. And I think part of the point is, hey, guess what? All of those things are still happening. Even as great and mighty as the Persians are, there's still a lot of more turmoil coming, because that's what happens. We're going to jump all the way to chapter 12 and start in verse 8. Because you can, at your leisure, go back and read about all those battles and different kings, and some of them more specific and seem to be about what's happening right then, and some of them seem to be pointed more towards the future. Verse 8 of chapter 12, I heard, but I did not understand. I get it. You got this strange guy with lightning for a face, and what does this all mean, and all these battles? But he does the right thing. Look what he does. So I asked, right? You don't know, you ask. My Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? He replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. Many will be purified, made spotless, and refined, but the wicked will continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished, and the abomination that causes desolation is set up for 1,290 days, blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of the 1,335 days. Okay, there are people that tell you they know exactly what that means. I don't think it's meant to be as specific, but the idea is these things are going to happen. They're going to continue to happen. Things are going to look bad, then they're going to look better, and then they're going to look bad again. That process is just on recycle, right? But as those of us who are people of God, what are we going to take from that? If the Israelites, maybe the best thing they learned in captivity was to have a broader view of what Yahweh was doing in the world. Because it was easy to think he's our God right here in Judea. He's kind of the God of Judea, but Babylon gave them a different picture, a more expansive view. He is not one of the gods. He is Lord of Lords, King of Kings, the God over all. So look at verse 13. As you go your way to the end. Stay faithful. Keep doing what you're doing. You will rest, and then at the end of the days you will rise to receive your allotted inheritance. What does that sound like? What picture does that give you? The Old Testament's not big on resurrection, but to me it appears to God is trying to see and show Daniel there's something greater, there's something beyond. I'm in control. All these things are going to continue to happen. But you're going to find rest, and you're going to find resurrection. It's not going to end with all the troubles and turmoils of this world. It's easy to think that, right? When we just think about ourselves being in control, then Hollywood makes a lot of movies about the apocalypse, about everything just going horrendously wrong and the world as we know it ending. Because what else do they have? What other end to the story is there? It makes sense if that's where you're starting. But I think the Israelites, and we see it, even as they're going home, Daniel's saying there's something larger that God is doing. There's something global that he's ruling. And I find that refreshing. So that's the backdrop that brings us to Ezra chapter 4. You remember what happened last week? They laid the foundation, lots of shouting, lots of noise. So we get to chapter 4. It's not going to just go smooth now that they got started, right? When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and the heads of the families and said, "Let us help you build. Like you, we seek your God and have been sacrificing to him since the time of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us here." Okay, so let's open that up just a little bit. You have the Jews who returned, and now this other group. We don't hear this term used, but these are the folks by Jesus' time who are the Samaritans, right? He tells us, just like we talked about in the first week, the Assyrians mixed people up. They took some of the Jews away and they never came back. They left some. They brought other people. They intermarried. That's the connection to the Samaritans. The people of the north, if you remember, when Israel divided north and south, they quit going to Jerusalem to worship. And I don't know if you remember that moment exactly, but if you go back and look at it, the leaders of the north have a very specific strategy. We need to not let our people go back to Jerusalem and worship, because when it started out, they were doing that. You remembered why the people in the north didn't want that to happen? Is because they were like, man, if they just keep going back and worship and they sit down to these people that are related to us, they might decide one day, what is this that's dividing us, and get back together, and basically we'll lose all our power here in the north because our people once again want to be part of the larger Israel. So we can't have that. We got to keep them divided. So that's when they started setting up alternate places of worship. It wasn't that they would not worship Yahweh, but they wouldn't go to Jerusalem to do it. So that's the background. And I think what's happening here is these new people came in. I don't think they became Yahweh-only worshipers, right? But they added the worship of Yahweh along with everybody else. They had respect. This is the God of this area. That would fit their mindset and how they did things. And so I don't think it's a dishonesty for them to say, yeah, we've been worshiping Yahweh the whole time. Yeah, we just added it on with everybody else. But I do have a hard time thinking their offer to help is altruistic, right? Oh, these people need some help. Let's go help them. I have a hard time envisioning that. I think what's happening is they're like, let's go offer to be involved so we can figure out how to shut this down. Because these newcomers are moving in, and they started out in the north, but they've expanded. You know, they're not a great nation, but hey, we do what we can. We encompass areas that we can kind of absorb. Because look at verse 3. But Zerubbabel and Joshua and the rest of the heads of the families of Israel answered, "You have no part with us in building of a temple to our God. We alone will build it for the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, commanded us." I would like to have more information. I'd like to be able to ask questions. Because I don't want to say Zerubbabel was just perfect, right? Are they feeling superior and they don't want any help? Do they understand this is a political ploy? You know, how much was understood on both sides? That would be interesting to be able to unpack. Because I think you're aware there can be two sides and they each can tell their own story, and it's hard to believe they're talking about the same thing. Have you ever witnessed that? That's called the U.S. government, right? So it's not hard for me to imagine back then those same kind of things were happening, where depending on what side you were on, you told the story a little different, you kind of had your own things you emphasized. But for whatever reason, Zerubbabel and Joshua don't seem to fall for this invitation to accept this help. One, they have been assigned, they have been funded by Cyrus. It's hard to have trust for these guys and what their motives are. I get that. They're new to each other. But I think their caution is borne out in verse 4 by what happens next, right? Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah and make them afraid to go on building. They bribed officials to work against them and frustrate their plans during the entire reign of Cyrus, king of Persia, down to the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So that's at least 14 years. Depending on when you date those two kings, it could even be 16 years. But you get the idea. Here's now a significant amount of time that even though they've started the rebuilding of the temple, they're going to have problems, and they don't make very much progress. In fact, you know, they have other things to do. They got their fields to plant. They got to have food. They're trying to build their houses. And as excited as they were in chapter 3, reality of life comes. Just getting started doesn't mean there's not a lot of hard work ahead. And now, on top of all of that, they have these people who are trying to get them to stop, who are actively discouraging, even paying people off to make it harder. Good thing that never happens anymore, that somebody would use officials to frustrate their plans or something. Okay, now we get to the choose your own ending part. It's not really ending, it's really more choose your own middle. Because as we get to verse 6, something strange happens. We're tracking pretty along the way with Cyrus, and we know who Darius is, but now we talk about Xerxes and Artaxerxes. And they are kings of Persia, but they don't show up for about 60 years. So what are they doing here in the middle of this story? So there's a couple explanations. One is Xerxes and Artaxerxes may have been more of a title. And so a different king in between, and there were some kings in between Cyrus and Darius. There was Cyrus's son, and there was a guy named Guamada, who, why Cambyses is off fighting. That's the son of Darius. He kind of takes over for about 10 months. So there's a couple of kings that this could have been in here, that this would be a historical flow. That's what we like, right? We want this to be a written history. And for us then that would mean it's a chronological timeline. But that may not have been Ezra's purpose in writing. We're familiar with different kinds of literature. I think it's the other explanation, that he's not trying to give a historical timeline. I think he is historically accurate, but not given a timeline in Ezra. So it's important to know what's going on, and if you're convinced that it's a timeline, it's really not going to change the bigger meaning, okay? So I'm okay with that. You can think it's Chambliss and Guamata, and I can like that because I probably used to lean that way at one time too. But here's what I think's happening. Starting in verse 6, that this is a parenthesis. He started telling us, Ezra, because here's the thing, remember, we're reading the book of Ezra, but has Ezra shown up yet? No, he's telling the story before he gets back. Ezra's still in Babylon. He comes with a later group that comes in not long from now, but he's not here yet. So when he's writing this story, he's starting it earlier, picking it back up from the beginning. And I think what happens here is he does a parenthesis. So yeah, we had some trouble when we were rebuilding the temple. Guess what? Later, when we're rebuilding the wall under Xerxes and Artaxerxes, guess what? We had the same kind of trouble. What's the bigger message? Either way, even when you're doing good things, you're probably going to find opposition. You're going to find people who aren't in agreement. You're going to find people who want to have power over, and they try to intimidate. They try to use force. They try to get their way for whatever their purposes are. Either way, I think this story makes that point, and it is instructive to us so that we're not surprised. It's always interesting to watch kids, and they think they have a brilliant idea, and they tell it to everybody else, and everybody's like, no, we don't think so. Because they have a different agenda, right? So let's look at that, and when we get down to verse 12, I'll tell you what tipped the scales for me. So I kind of give you both timelines. So verse 6 says, at the beginning of the reign of Xerxes. If it's Xerxes, he doesn't, historical records show he becomes king in 485. And we're in the 530s at best. Right? So 45 years or so. Maybe a couple more on that. So Xerxes, we're too early for Xerxes. But if it's Cyrus's son, Cambyses, he was king about 530. That would fit the timeline. And we're really not told much about Xerxes. It says these guys around Jerusalem, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem. You remember in Job, the word used for the Satan, the Satan? What was it, Andy? You remember? It's the accuser.
The accuser.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
This is the same word right here. They're kind of like, these guys were the Satan. They were the accuser. They were the ones that were really pushing back on us. And that's really kind of all we're told about the Xerxes part. And immediately in verse 7, it goes, in the days of Artaxerxes. Well, Artaxerxes followed Xerxes. He's about 465 BC. So again, way after the time that they're rebuilding the temple. So here's the first clue. We start hearing some names we haven't heard before. Rehum. I guess he only sang songs other people sing. Sorry. That'll sink in a minute. I need to share that one with Gunner, don't I?
Yes.
That's about his, yeah. Rehum, the commanding officer, and Shimshai, the secretary, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to Artaxerxes. So this is not just informal, casual pushback. This is official people in charge stirring up trouble. We've not heard these names before. So that could be an indication that this is during the time of the Xerxes and Artaxerxes, we know, and not in the 530s, but in the 460s. Okay, you with me? So it's not just them, though. Look in verse 9. Together with the rest of their associates, the judges, officials, administrators over the people from Persia, Uruk, and Babylon, the Emilites of Susa, and the other people whom the great and honorable Ashurbanipal, that's probably not even close, I just said something, deported and settled in the city of Samaria and elsewhere in the Trans-Euphrates. So naming who these are, yes, these are the descendants that this Ashurbanipal, that's the Assyrian guy. Remember him? He was really bad. He brought all these people in here. They're referring back to him. These people are part of that group, which guess what? That's the same group that's giving Zerubbabel and Joshua problems. I think that's the connection, not the timeline. But, hey, look, this same Samaritan group of people, if we can use that for a shorthand, 50 years later, still making problems. This time it's with Xerxes and Artaxerxes. They write this letter. But let's go ahead and go to verse 12. The king should know that the people who came up to us from you have gone to Jerusalem and are rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city. They are restoring the walls and repairing the foundations. So why is that a clue? Well, when we were with Zerubbabel and Joshua, what were they doing? They're rebuilding the temple. Rebuilding of the wall doesn't come until the time of Xerxes and Artaxerxes under Nehemiah. That comes later. And so to me it makes sense because this would all be known to them. It's like us telling a story that we're aware of, referencing Abraham Lincoln today, and everybody goes, yeah, that's from the past. That's from a different time. We would know that. We don't get Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, sorry, a little Texan. No, it's not Texan, it's Oklahoman, sorry. Denise straightened me out because she's not claiming that Washington. That's an Oklahomanism. It just makes sense that we would know the difference that they would. And so it's harder for us because we're removed and we don't know all the names and it's not part of our history. But to me, that was kind of the tipping point. Oh, he's telling about the time they were rebuilding the city, not rebuilding the temple. But guess what? Same kind of things are happening. Same kind of things are going on. Verse 13. Furthermore, the king. This just sounds like a tattletale letter, doesn't it? Mom, you won't believe what my sister did. Furthermore, the king should know that if this city is built, its walls are restored, no more taxes. Tribute or duty will be paid, and eventually the royal revenues will suffer. Don't you like it? They are such nice people. They're saying, King, we are only thinking of you. This is going to hurt you. If you let these people get away with that. Now, since we're under obligation to the palace, it is not proper for us to see the king dishonored, because we are such loyal servants. We are sending this message to inform the king, so that a search may be made in the archives of your predecessors. In their records, you will find that this city is a rebellious city, troublesome to the kings and provinces, a place with a long history of sedition. Okay, so why is this letter going to be a problem? Well, that part's true. When they go back and they look through the history, the king's going to go, yeah, they're right. These people were horrible to us. They didn't cooperate with our history of having power over them. That is why this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is built and its walls are restored, you will be left with nothing in Trans-Euphrates. You're saying everything on this side of the Euphrates? Gone. That's going to hurt you. That's going to hurt your pocketbook. Don't you want all those taxes? So verse 17 comes the reply to Rehum and Shamshay, all those guys living there. I don't like to read all those names since I do it so poorly. Greetings. The letter you sent to us has been read and translated into my presence. Oh, here's another clue. This whole section is written, even in the Hebrew Bible, in Aramaic. And that becomes more prevalent later than earlier. So that's a third clue, that maybe even had a copy of this letter that Ezra puts in here, connecting these two same kind of stories. I issued an order, and a search was made, and it was found that this city has a long history of revolt against kings and has been a place of rebellion and sedition. Jerusalem has had powerful kings ruling over the whole of the Trans-Euphrates, Solomon, right? And taxes and tribute and duty were paid to them. Now issue an order to these men to stop work, so that the city will not be rebuilt until I so order. Be careful not to neglect this matter. Why let this threat grow to the detriment of the royal interest? It makes sense. These people are long off. The king has limited information. He's not doubting whether they have some of their own interests or not. This is a potential threat to the king. So he said, yeah, let's stop this, rebuilding this city. As soon as a copy of the letter of King Artaxerxes was read to Rehum and Shimshai, the secretary, and their associates, they went immediately to the Jews in Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. So, that's the end of the parentheses, I think. We come to that moment where Ezra's made his point. Doing the work of God isn't necessarily linear and straight. There's going to be opposition. And there's not just a single opposition. Somewhere in our background, in our cultural DNA, we've developed this idea, if I can just solve this one problem, everything else falls into place, right? Has that ever happened for you? No, what happens? You solve one, and guess what? There's a new one. Andy, did you recently solve a big problem?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you got an air compressor installed and working and your pneumatic tools, great shape. I got bad news for you. There's going to be a new one to solve.
The heat pump died.
Okay, the heat pump died. It's already here. It didn't even wait, right? I think that's the point. Let's think about, why is Ezra writing this? I think as an encouragement. Look at the things we went through. Look at the hard times. Recently and later, and we'll get to more of the later, but he's bringing that point in early. This is not a single thing to solve. But you know what? God sustained us. We kept going. We trusted in Him. Even when we were getting physical, forceful resistance. Right? We didn't quit. We didn't give up. Now they stopped for a while. I don't want to paint the other side. They were just always like, yeah, everything's great. They were discouraged. They had hard times. They wondered, should we? They had all of the doubts that we sometimes have, right? They're not different than us. So the chapter ends with verse 24. Thus the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And like we said, that's 14, 16-year gap there. And maybe Ezra told that story to remind people that read about those guys and thinking, well, if I'd been there, I wouldn't have stopped, right? Same thing we do when we go, man, if I'd been alive when Jesus was alive, I wouldn't have doubted. Well, I tend to think I wouldn't have done any different than they did, right? If I lived in that culture and I had the expectations of that culture, and this guy comes along and he's talking upside down, I would probably had a hard time. It would have taken me a while. I have sympathy rather than disgust for them, right? I tend to go, probably would have taken me longer than Peter, as stubborn as he was, right? Maybe that's what Ezra's doing. So they don't go, oh, those people back then, yeah, they didn't have enough faith. Well, okay, remember, close to our day, this is what happened. This is an ongoing problem. But even when it appears that the work has stopped, that doesn't mean it has ended. Right? Our time expectations and the way we tell time is different than God's expectation. If we're not the ones to carry it forward, He'll get somebody else. He is not dependent on me. He would like to use me, and He's very willing to, right? Come on, join Him. But He's not going to go, oh, well, I don't got those guys. We can't do anything. He'll just go around us. He'll just keep going. So our invitation is not to be who God needs, but our invitation is to add to what God is doing. Is that fair? So that it's not dependent on us, but it is expanded if we are choosing to be part and join. Yeah. Something to think about. So that brings us to chapter 5. That's a pretty good stopping point. Chapter 5, we're going to pick back up at the temple, right? So that's why that section to me makes sense that it's a parenthesis, because we go right back to chapter 5, and we're going to introduce Haggai and Zechariah. There are 3 prophets in this section: Zechariah, Haggai, and then later Malachi. but particularly some of the things that Haggai and Zechariah have to say, we'll bring in starting next week. Glad you're here.
So you feel about heat pump?